What's happening? Welcome to the JATV Show. I'm not on my own today. We've got two of Unite's activists. Is that right? Activists?
Organisers.
We're also activists.
So I've got Claire Peden and Bryan Simpson, who I've known both for a very, very long time. We're here to talk about what's going on with workers. So obviously, Nicola Sturgeon announced a lockdown. But also in the whole of the UK is in lockdown. So I suppose most of what we're going to be talking about will be suitable for all workers to sort of know. Bryan, so obviously when it comes to a lockdown, there's a lot of restrictions now in place. The situation's changed by law. Do you want to just give us a bit of background what the current situation is like?
Yeah, so many of you will have seen Nicola Sturgeon's statement on Monday that technically from yesterday it's now unlawful to leave your home in a Tier 4 area, which is pretty much all of mainland Scotland. So what that means is effectively what we had in March, except even stronger. So you can not leave your home or your garden except for essential reasons. One of those essential reasons is for work. But unlike in March, where there was kind of, it was a lot more vague in terms of what was essential work and what wasn't, they've now been quite clear that essential work is that you cannot do from home. So for example, if you obviously work in a hospital or work in the NHS or work in social care, that's absolutely essential work. But even if you're in, for example, food distribution, where you can work from home, for example, you're doing emails or phone calls, you should not be leaving the house. You should not be travelling to work. So our big thing at the moment is putting that pressure on the employers, many of whom are still making the workers come into work. And they could be stopped. The cops could stop them and put a fine on them for just travelling to work.
Who is when it comes to, you talk about employers, who is the target for employers? Is it big employers? Is it small businesses? Is it everybody? And do you find that there is differences with, say, small businesses and maybe they don't know as much, or they maybe break the rules and stuff because it is a maybe smaller, tighter team? Or is your target like the bigger companies that are sort of still just want their employees to come in and not really taking
it's
serious?
Kind of everybody. We've had examples, I'm sure Claire will corroborate this, we've had examples from tiny, family-run businesses to multinational corporations. Obviously, from our perspective, there's less excuse. There's no excuse for making any worker going to work when they don't need to, but there's less excuse from multinationals because they've got millions, if not billions of quid to spend on, for example, laptops or phones for staff that might not have them. But that might have been an excuse in March. It's not an excuse now. The idea that someone who could work from home hasn't yet, 10, 11 months later, been provided a laptop. Do you know what I mean? To be able to work from home. So we've got examples, for example, I don't know whether I should name the company just yet because the workers are still in the infancy stage of organising around it, but a large hospitality company based in Glasgow here, where they're making 40 workers come into their head office, and they are technically in food distribution and deliveries, but the jobs that these people are doing could absolutely be done from home. So they've got laptops, they've got phones, they only need to really be coordinating stuff like bookings through email and phone. So the idea that they need to come into a warehouse or come into an office is just nonsense. But it's all about power, it's all about control, and a lot of these companies, they want their workers under one roof so that they can performance manage them in the middle of a pandemic. Like, it's just shocking.
So Claire, since the first lockdown back in March 2020, I know you've been supporting workers across the board in every sort of walk of life. What sort of things have you been doing to empower some of the workers?
Well, I think the main thing that I hope I do, and I hope any other sort of organiser or activist would do, is encourage people to speak out and speak out against their employer. It's quite daunting, I think, for people to do that because, as Bryan said, it is a bit about power, and your boss holds the power. So people find when they speak up, they then become either victimised or left out, and it's very much a sort of divide and conquer situation. So what we would always advise is most issues aren't like individual issues. When you start asking your colleagues, the people you work with, you'll find that they probably experience the same issues as yourself. And one example that we experienced during the first lockdown was it was actually an NHS, and it was workers who had childcare issues, and they were or caring issues, and they were made to take special leave, or they weren't allowed to take the special leave that they applied for, and forced to take holidays, unpaid leave, sickness, and then basically that was just the norm for them, so they accepted it. One worker eventually spoke up and reached out to colleagues, found out that everyone was experiencing the same thing, so they were all losing money. And what they done is they all got together, which is one of the things that we would all say, get together with your colleagues, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, whether it's a call, anyway, so you're all on the same page, and challenge it. Take the challenge to your boss together. So not one person is putting sort of their head up above the parapet themselves, because it just singles you out. It's very much about collective strength, and it works. They went forward, they got a petition, and they got all their colleagues that were affected by it to sign it, and they took it to management, and within 2 weeks it was sorted, and they were then allowed special leave for certain circumstances.
So no, for your social media, you have quite a lot of success, and it doesn't matter. I've seen Bryan up at like places like Dundee, and it's maybe a small bar or a small restaurant, or you even take on, as Bryan said, multinational corporations and stuff. What is the success rate? Do you feel like it's a constant battle against some employers, or do you feel like you're actual moving ground and getting people in the right direction? Sometimes
it feels like a bit of both, I suppose. Sometimes you just feel it's constant, and there are a lot of bad employers out there that have got away with certain behaviours over the years, not just COVID related. I mean, one of the things is Bryan talks about legislation and how that should support workers, but what we know from experience is legislation needs to be enforced. We've got legislation for minimum wage, for annual leave, for maternity pay, but quite a lot of the situations that we see that even this isn't enforced. So that's where we need to work towards empowering each and every worker, so they, no matter where they work, they're willing to challenge when things aren't right. They're willing to get together with their colleagues and willing to challenge when things aren't right. And I think that also feeds into our outside lives outside our work, where we need to challenge, I suppose, things that just aren't right, whether it's cuts to public services, privatisation, anything like that. We need to start the fight in our communities, start the fight in our workplace, and then that'll expand and we'll take the fight into.
Okay, Bryan, this time of year traditionally, like a lot of people maybe get temporary jobs during Christmas and New Year, and then in January it comes and a lot of people are sort of laid off, that there's no more work from stuff. That coupled with, say, the changes and maybe Brexit legislation and stuff and a lockdown, do you think this is the toughest time it's maybe been for some people, especially maybe young people and students as well, who are finding themselves in a situation where they've got no income? And I don't know, is there other issues around maybe students and things like that they're not entitled to some government support, like because they're students, and it sort of puts them in a position where they're forced to work for maybe less the minimum wage or crazy hours or 0-hour contracts?
Mm-hmm. So I've been in an informal and formal capacity supporting workers since the last financial crash in 2009, and this is way worse. This is like a lot worse, because as you say, you've got a toxic combination of a pandemic mixed in with, it's uncovering already precarious fractures in the economy. So take hospitality, for example. It was already the lowest paid, the most precarious, the most sexual harassment, the most racism of any industry. That has just been exacerbated by the fact that the pandemic hit the industry first, because it was the first to have to close. But then if there were, for example, unions involved more heavily in hospitality, if we'd been organising in there for 15, 20 years, as we have been, for example, in retail or in the care sector, we would not have had this situation. So I'm not saying it's unions' fault, but ultimately when 10% of the industry is actually in a union, they don't know where to turn. But from a positive perspective, what we've seen over the last 9-10 months, and I'm sure Claire will corroborate this, is thousands of workers coming together for the first time, 19 and 20-year-old bar workers, restaurant workers, migrant workers, housekeepers in hotels, realising their collective worth and their individual legal rights and putting those into practice, as Claire says, empowering themselves because the law is absolutely not on the side of workers, as Claire says. So, an employer is not going to apply those laws unless they're made to. And the government's not going to make them. The cops are not going to rock up to a hotel and say you're not paying the minimum wage. So the only people that can actually enforce that are the workers. And that, if someone says to me, "What is a union?" that's what it is. It's not some third party that goes away and fixes stuff for you and you pay them a tenner a month. It's the collective voice of workers. Yes, we provide legal support, we provide political support. We've got a lot of influence. Whether it be the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, Westminster, but ultimately it's workers coming together. Just to give you one example, the West Brewery that everyone knows on Glasgow Green, they had a lot of issues back in March where they furloughed workers, but there was all sorts of problems with their wages. They weren't getting paid the proper wages. Then when the second lockdown hit, they tried to bring the staff back to work in the warehouse when it was totally unsafe. Our members, we only had maybe 15, 20 members at the time, got together, put in a collective letter. We doubled that to 40 members, put in a collective letter representing 80% of the workforce. The company had no option but to capitulate. Not only did they pay 80% of the wages, they furloughed all the staff, but they reversed redundancies that they were going to make. So that's an example of where a company thought it could get away with health and safety breaches, redundancies, and we, the collective we, with the union support, forced them to think again.
Claire, I know there's information that you've shared information with me, so I know it exists for employers. For employers to know, like someone's maybe starting a new business or maybe a business is taking off because of Corona's a lot of online stuff going on. What can employers that want to do the right thing, where can they find this information? This is what you should be doing. This is the requirements you should be meeting. This is how you should be supporting your staff. Because as an employee, you shouldn't always be scared of the unions. I think there's maybe employers that are, and sometimes they get the right to be, but if they're not pulling their weight and doing the right thing. But employers should be working with unions because the end result will be a happier workforce where people feel like, and then when you get a happy workforce, obviously there's more, what's that word I'm looking for? More morale, but there's productivity. That's it, productivity. I remember seeing if we reduced to like a 4-day week, you would work it. You'd actually get more productivity in it. So, if employers actually wanted to be like, listen, I need to find information so I make sure I'm doing everything right, and I've got my employees are aware of what their rights are. Where can they find that information?
So it depends on sort of the situation. If, per se, a company has union recognition or union involvement with its organisers, reps, they can get that advice from them. But the main thing is everything's at the click of a button. Absolutely everything is available on, whether it's ACAS, whether it's the government websites, whether it's citizens' advice. There's advice for employees and employers that want to find out more. And one of the things I always say is do your homework. The information's free. There's loads of places you can get it, whether it's the Scottish Trade Union Congress website or the TUC, whether it's Better Than Zero, whether it's Unite. There is tons of information out there for free that you can just read up on. Quite often we hear these excuses that, we didn't know. I mean, one example I had is a restaurant owner that didn't pay his workers any annual leave over a 3-year period. Challenged that with the workers. Workers got together, got in touch, and we basically put in a letter just challenging it. And he came back to us and said, well, I offer free food, I offer this and I offer that. And I was like, but that doesn't make up for annual leave, which obviously they've accumulated through their work. But in his mind, he thought, I give all these other great benefits, and if I give annual leave, then you'll lose these benefits. And we had to say, well, it's not a comparison. They're legally entitled to that as well. And he went away and he read up on it and he came back and they got paid for the years that they hadn't been paid. They paid it up and added that into obviously what they should be getting. But so sometimes it is a case of they don't know. Quite a lot of times, I would say what we see it's intentional, and they use the fact that the workers don't know legislation inside out, regulations inside out to their advantage. But if they're looking for information, it's all there. It's all online, and they can reach out to to any trade unions.
What would you say to businesses that are struggling and they've been, just say that it has been a good workplace and everybody's happy, but they're finding themselves in a situation where they're struggling and they're not able to like pay their staff, and what can they do? Where can they go for help? Can they get it for the union, or do they need to look at the government? Or
the employees can approach their own trade union. There are different support things in place for them, basically. The employers can't, unfortunately. They would, again, have to look at the government website. It is a really, really difficult time just now for businesses, particularly small businesses. We completely understand that, but nothing should be to the detriment of the workers, and they're already taking a massive hit, as Bryan said. I mean, I think after, I suppose, once we start to come at the other end of this, we have to look at the massive issues with precarious work, if hospitality workers had much more secure contracts and better pay, and I just think people would be more prepared, would have the savings that, was it Rishi Sunak came out and said that they could use and things like that. Yeah. But unfortunately, the way the system's been set up now for many years, people don't have that security blanket or safety net of savings.
I think for me personally, like, workers are there through the good times and they're building up the businesses, and now that we've had a tough time, employers need to repay that sort of loyalty and that's maybe some, like, I obviously I have a small business, I know how difficult it's been, but at the same time I wouldn't have a business if it wasn't for the people who's worked alongside me. But Bryan, is there like a bigger picture that maybe, because a lot of what goes on the ground comes from maybe policies in government, or I don't know, like banks no getting money and then there's an after effect. Is there a sort of bigger picture other than maybe getting rid of the Tories or something? But is it like what is it, the big picture? What is it that people, everyday people, can do, even that they come together, not just in a union, but come together and sort of challenge some of the legislation or things that just aren't going on to protect people?
Obviously, the pandemic, do you know what I mean? Even the Tories didn't create the pandemic, but as Claire said, what it's done, a fundamental or the largest public health crisis that we've faced in living memory, has merely uncovered what already existed. Do you know what I mean? What we're seeing in the NHS, the reason the NHS is about to be overwhelmed is fundamentally because the Tories have starved it of funding for 10 years. And Labour before that. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't as if New Labour done anything more radical. Working people, the poorer you are in society, the worse you will be affected by a public health crisis. That's not because we're more prone to the virus. It's because we live in more cramped housing. We don't have gardens. We work in precarious jobs. We've got less access to. We don't have any access to private healthcare, and we have less access, if you like, to even public health and social care and support. So, and not to mention the mental health crisis that acutely affects poorer people. So the only antidote to that is the general coming together of those people, because, as Claire said, the bosses and the government, if you like, those in power generally, think they've got the power, but ultimately it's not them that makes the profit, it's working people. And even if you don't work, even if you've lost your job, I've represented people who have lost 4 jobs since March, have lost their job 4 times since March. So, like, it's not about, do you work or do you not work? If you're working class, if you depend on your job to live, then you are part of that movement that can actually make a change. And coming together, and the trade union movement is only one major example of that. For 150 years, workers, well, for thousands of years, but for 150 years, workers have been coming together en masse through a trade union movement. And everything you can think of, from the weekend. I mean, people used to work 7 days a week, all the time. Children used to work, 5-year-olds would work in factories. That was only stopped because workers got together and put pressure on the bosses. The minimum wage, maternity rights, everything that you can think of that's decent in the workplace that protects you has been as a result of workers coming together through their union. But without moving on to maybe your next question, it's not just through unions. You know, there's tenants unions. There's or not just through workplace unions. Sorry, there's, you know, renters can come together to challenge unscrupulous practices with landlords. The key message is that working people are the antidote to the Tories or whoever is in power in enforcing what is an unfair system.
So if someone was in a situation where they're unhappy with their employer, they're not part of a union right now, what would be your advice to them for them to be able to get help and support? How would they go about it?
So I had a conversation 2 hours ago with a worker who's never been in a union. They're in their mid-20s. You know, they didn't even know what a union was. They work for that large hospitality employer that I was mentioning earlier. And they just said to me, look, I'm happy to join the union, but I don't really know what I'm doing. Like, what should we do? And they, as I said, are being forced to come into work, travel 3 or 4 miles through Glasgow in public transport when there's absolutely no need. Like, they can be working from home. The company just doesn't want to provide them the resources. They have got computers. They don't even want to send them to their houses. It would cost a few £100. So the advice I gave to him was obviously join the union, because frankly we can't give that advice and protect you. For example, we can't represent people who aren't in the union for obvious reasons. But the number one advice I gave him was get your colleagues on a WhatsApp group. Once you've hit 50-60% of them, start putting together a collective letter. Will help you with the wording of it. We can put the legislation in there to put the proverbial shits up the employer, but ultimately it's about you collectively coming together. If you as an individual, you could put the strongest legal threat in writing to your employer and they would just ignore it. The reason they can't ignore it is because you've got 80% of the office on that letter. So that's the number one piece of advice, is just get together with your colleagues, preferably through a union, and challenge what is going on, even if it's not unlawful. It's immoral. Do you know what I mean? Like, for a lot of the examples that we come across, I can't remember if the parental leave thing, obviously that is a right, but I don't know if it's actually they were legally entitled to it. But that's something that absolutely they should be getting. We don't think $8.72 an hour is enough to live on, but that's the basic minimum. So you can't demand from an employer that they pay you £10 an hour legally, but you can morally. Yeah. So that's why we campaign for the real living wage. So it's about, realising your collective strength as a workforce and sending a message to the employer that you're the one that makes the profits and you're the one that can withdraw your labour or stop making the profits if they don't change their ways.
And we've seen a case of it during the first lockdown as well, and I'm sure it was in food production. It was factory workers. There was no health and safety sort of measures implemented, so obviously high risk with COVID, and what they done is they all basically stood outside, socially distant demo in the car park. They just all stood 2 metres apart with their high-vis vests on and refused to go back in to the workplace. And it's not saying that people should withdraw their labour unless they have to, but it's about having the power that they can, because if they don't work, that's the production, the profit. Do you know what I mean? That's everything that employers want. So they, ultimately, workers do hold the power. It's just getting them to realise it quite a lot of the time.
Do you think this is going to be a massive setback for employee rights and workers' rights? Because you said about health and safety. I'd imagine companies are going to be trying to cut money and make savings even after this and long after this. And you're going to find people that think, well, I need a job, so I'm going to take the shit parts of the job just so I've got an income coming in.
Definitely.
Does that worry?
Yes. I think we already had massive issues with workers thinking, I feel lucky to have a job, I'm lucky to have this, and I think we'll see much more of that. We've already seen a sort of erosion of our rights at work over the years anyway, but that is where the collective strength part of this doesn't change, even if the legislation changes, because you can still fight for better working conditions as a collective. And we've seen it before, people campaigning for paid taxis home after a late night shift, and they won it because they got together with their colleagues and they fought for it. So that's nowhere in legislation. But
set a precedent.
Yep.
It's weird that when we were working up to Christmas Day and it was freezing outside, and I just say the guys I work with, I said, "Oh, I'll just get you an Uber home." They're like, "No, I'll get the bus." And I'm like, in my head, like my employer back in the day got me a taxi home. But I worked in a nightclub, right, and it was they just gave us everybody get taxis, right, and you wouldn't maybe imagine you would get like, a nightclub would be like what they did. Like it was Destiny bloody nightclub in Cambridge Street. I remember we all get a whole line of taxis lined up to get the same, and I just assumed that's what the norm was.
People don't know that now. Like people would say to me when we're doing the campaign, they would say, "Why should they get a taxi home? You take the job, you know you need to go." And then folk were getting in touch saying, "Back in the day, I say back in the day, but
That's
we used to get
6
a
o'clock
taxi.
at night. I was at 6 o'clock, but it was freezing. I was like, I don't want you waiting enough.
You got a taxi home. It was part of your job. I mean, it was you worked in hospitality, you worked late nights. Your employer paid for your taxi home. But nowadays, it's like bare minimum wages, keeping tips, bosses keeping tips, and then
I hate that.
Finishing up midnight, no way to get to the train station except for a walk, or you pay a couple hours wages on a taxi. How's this fair? But this is where, again, you can still overcome quite a lot of these challenges with sort of collective power.
So, Brian, what about, I imagine there's going to be people that are a bit invisible to everybody. There's maybe people that are on agency work and they don't know what the rights are, or again, that they're forced into a position where they're like, I just need a job, I just need an income, and everything else they don't want to risk. Maybe they're the only person that, like, in this building, I know the cleaners are based here, but there could be cleaners that come in that are agency workers and they're only sent here for an hour themselves. Maybe they're unhappy with their work. Is there anything that protects them in the same way that it protects somebody that's in a contract?
Yeah, so you've got the agency worker regulations which protect all workers from equality breaches. So you could be in the job a day and you're automatically protected under the Equality Act from being treated detrimentally on account of your sexuality, your gender, your race, your marriage status, your age. I've forgotten one, always forget one. But like nationality, so migrant workers, and that was a question I didn't really answer earlier on that you asked. You know, the toxic combination of Brexit happened at the same time as this pandemic. Like, we've represented migrant workers who they're not just going to lose their job. Some of them are being evicted from their staff accommodation, and then because they lose their living status, are being deported, as in might lose their settled status. I just represented a group of workers just before Christmas up in the Highlands, who were sent a letter saying, we're not going to furlough you, we're sacking you, we're closing, we're not going to close the hotel, we're going to keep the Scottish workers. I mean, it didn't actually say that, but they only sent it to migrant workers. So you had 5 different nationalities, all of whom were evicted from their staff accommodation. By the way, 2 days after the Scottish government made that unlawful. So we had to get the workers together, teamed up with the Scottish workers as well, put pressure on them, had huge social media, mainstream media, it was like front cover of The Guardian, put pressure on the company to withdraw the evictions, but they're still going to sack them. So these workers are, the company's been forced to keep them in the staff accommodation and feed them, but they don't have a job, they don't have any income. But the point in which we got involved, half of the migrant workers had already spent 500 quid in flights, like spent their entire furlough wage for that month, the week before Christmas, on flights back to Spain, Poland, Bulgaria, because, and that's, I don't think it's unlawful, but that's pretty dodgy to have to go from like Aviemore to Edinburgh to get a flight on public transport, spending 500 quid to get home because their employer wouldn't spend. And by the way, for those that don't know what an employer has to contribute, it's 5 to 10% of your wage is all they need to contribute to furlough you. The government, we as the taxpayers, pay the other 80%. So for the average worker in that hotel, it would have cost them 70 quid a month, a multinational employer, to furlough their workers. So I would say, it's no bottom trumps in terms of who's the worst affected, but I would say migrant workers are definitely doubly affected, because they might not just lose their job or their home, but after Hogmanay, and I don't want to scaremonger here because obviously there's UN rights to settled status, but their protection in terms of being able to stay here as a migrant worker is reduced massively, diluted when they lose their job and their home.
Does workers' rights, does it come from the Scottish government, or is it more UK government based, or before was it European? And do you have people within like the Scottish government that you keep in contact and say, listen, put pressure on them to create policies or even like introduce laws that will protect people, even not just for workers, you said earlier about like tenants' rights and things like that. Do you see, has there been a positive change like coming to protect people, or do you think we're still a long way away from even noticing what's going on?
So immigration law is reserved to Westminster, so the Scottish government technically doesn't have huge, it can influence it, but it doesn't have, it can't create immigration law basically, but it can put policies and regulations in place that protect migrant workers post Brexit, and it has done nowhere near enough, but it's done some of that to protect them. But then, as you say, there's international legislation that the worker or the migrant worker can rely on. So, for example, they're still protected under their treaty right to settled status, as long as they have pre-settled status in that country. And again, I'm not an immigration specialist, but they are protected by international legislation in that. The problem, of course, with Westminster is that we've just got pretty much a no-deal Brexit. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was the last people they're going to care about are migrant workers. So there's not anything in place as a safety net to protect those workers that were previously protected under the Human Rights Act. So, and of course, there's still a grace period of like 3 to 6 months, but that does not. What the hell are these migrant workers going to do if COVID continues into June? Do you know what I mean? Like, if they don't have that pre-settled status. I've represented workers who spoke to a Spanish couple who'd already booked their flights because it was the third time that they'd been evicted from staff accommodation. So they thought that was normal. So they were like, not only do I not know what a union is, not only do I not know what my rights are, they didn't think it was wrong, morally or legally, to like evict them in the middle of December. So like, there's not even a concept. And that sounds as if I'm patronising them, but there isn't even like a concept. They assume that they should be treated like that because they're migrant workers. Like, how sad is that situation where they feel that they should accept that treatment? I had to convince them to get involved in a campaign to get their jobs back because they didn't want to rock the boat. They'd been promised by the employer their job back in February, even though they didn't have pre-settled status. So if they'd had, and I've advised them to sort that out, but if they want to come back, there's no legal protection for them to come back as a migrant worker without that pre-settled status. So it's like that employer has lied to them about what they can and can't do.
The other thing I suppose is if people are returning, if they've been here for years working and they are returning back to another European country, like they need time to get on their feet, and during this time it's impossible. I know, like, I've obviously got family in Italy, and some of the stuff that's going on there is like it's nuts. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we would accept it here, but then at the same time there's maybe, because some villages are small and everybody knows each other, there's a sort of, oh well, I just can't work or I'm not going to get paid, and there's just a sort of acceptance there. Whereas Glasgow, the biggest city in Scotland, for workers should be following rules and people should feel comfortable in their jobs, and if not, then the government should be providing that support. Could you get satisfaction at your job?
Yeah, definitely.
I know it sort of seems doom and gloom, but there must be something that you spoke about, some of the achievements and things like that.
Yes. I mean, there's nothing better than when workers win, basically. The win change that impacts their life, and it really does. Some of the changes really does impact their life. So I don't think you could do this job if you didn't get satisfaction from it.
I suppose as well that there's after effects. I mean, you could challenge something that then benefits maybe one group of workers, but because maybe it becomes law or it becomes like a standard practice, it then ripples out, and you find out that it's helping people that you'll never ever meet.
Yep. And once you get a group of workers that challenge something once, as I said earlier, they'll do that throughout the rest of their lives. And I worked with a group of workers in Glasgow, and just seeing them starting to get empowered when they started speaking out, started speaking to each other. They'd spent so many years just head down, getting on with it, getting treated really, really poorly by their employer. Once they started opening up the sort of serious these conversations, you've seen a change in their behaviours, and they realised, actually, I don't need to put up with that. And now they're like functioning trade union branch. They challenge things all the time. They speak out. They encourage others. Trained to be reps, so they now represent their colleagues when they're in need. And every time I think about that, you're just obviously it makes you really happy. And these people, the workers now, will go on and challenge things in all aspects of their lives.
Yeah, I suppose the skills that you're learning from being involved in like a trade union, you can then you start to identify other things that maybe things are not going right, as Bryan said, with the like living as a tenant or whatever.
Definitely.
And you think, right, I can challenge this. I should like, and it's good to see that, but I just think sometimes it's, as earlier we were saying, sometimes it's massive like companies that think they've got the power and the government's got the power. A few of my friends, like their families live in India. A few weeks ago we had the protests of what's going on, and I was saying to them, this is the biggest mobilisation of people in history, the like world protesting, and then after that, I think it was about a week after that, there was people that they maybe went a bit too extreme, but they ripped apart the company that was making parts for Apple, and it's in India, and they would have seen what's going on with the farmers and thought, no, well, we're unhappy about our working conditions. Some people hadn't been paid for 4 months or something like that, and they start to challenge it. But Britain wasn't that far, as Bryan said, is some of the rules and the laws that protect people, these are relatively in the last century, like a relatively new thing, and we've still got a long way to go. You said like, it's difficult to live in £6, £7, £8 an hour.
Exactly. We need to look at who's, as you said, look at who's complicit in it as well, with the exploitation that we're seeing. Who feeds into that? Who benefits from that exploitation of workers as well? And that is when you start to dig a bit deeper and you see sort of the bigger problem of it all.
And that's what Unite do. We've got a strategy called Leverage where we target everyone who's associated with that company. So I don't know why I'm saying this. Claire's been totally heavily involved, but you know, when BA tried to sack 12,000 workers and change the contracts of another 40-odd thousand, we didn't just hit BA, we hit all of these companies that were affiliated to it. That's what Better Than Zero almost grew massively on the basis of, was that we went for reputational damage. Now, some people think that's extreme, but it gets results for workers. Like the G1 group are now notorious in this city, and I'm not saying we created that notoriety, but we certainly exasperated from their perspective. They're terrified of putting a foot wrong now because we always make sure they get in the headlines. You know, West Brewery, one of the reasons we won that was because we were headline news in Channel 4. Like, people are starting to hear workers' voices, and that is what, in a day of, what do you call it, reputation is everything to these companies because it directly affects profit. So what Unite tries to do, what Better Than Zero does, is target that reputation in the absence of workers' collective, because the industries we're organising are still 80% don't know what the union is. So we almost need to start with a small group of workers and grow out from that, using social media, using mainstream media, to put pressure on the company, because customers don't want to. The vast majority of customers don't want to shop or eat or drink in venues or places which don't pay the minimum wage or treat their workers like shit. So we
keep their tips.
Or keep their tips. So that's one of the, Sorry, what was that, your question? I don't feel like it was.
I was thinking about something else, but no, my brain's just went blank. No, I've lost it. So, what do you see as being the biggest challenges now coming during the next few months if the pandemic still goes on, Brexit? Do we anticipate there's going to be worse workers' rights because of Brexit? Is that, because that's what my assumption was. My assumption was that like a lot of the Equalities Act and things like that might just go by the by because we've left Europe and they've not introduced this. Because I think I just feel we're moving in a direction where it's to suit these people that want to make trade deals with America and squash and don't really give a shit about people. I'm allowed to say shit.
I've said it twice. I need to make clear that I'm speaking absolutely in a personal capacity here. because the EU did not provide much protection anyway. The EU is not some kind of bastion of workers' rights. Do you know what I mean? It's still a neoliberal organisation that's, you know, you look at Germany, for example, which has a lot better workers' rights in legislation than we do. They have workers that sit on, what do you call it, the executives of most major corporations. But that's been because strong trade unions in Germany have demanded that. And I would say that's nowhere near far enough. You look at France, where a huge proportion of the public sector and the private sector's in a union, but they still have to go and strike every single week to get things like pensions. But to almost dual answer your question, Britain has got the worst employment rights on paper in Western Europe. I think, you know, on a par with America, if not worse. So, like, I worry that out with the scant protection that we had in the EU, that it could actually get even worse, especially for migrant workers. With, you know, we don't know what's going on with the Human Rights Act. We don't know what will be removed. And the Tories, you know, like, Boris Johnson's the most right-wing Prime Minister that we've had since 1990. Do you know what I mean? Like, at least since Thatcher. So you've got someone who doesn't just not care about workers. You know, he's handed £1 billion contracts to his actual friends during a pandemic. He's not going to care about ensuring, for example, that we've got a furlough. So the pressure, and I should have said this at the start, the pressure that's been brought to bear on Rishi Sunak, who is at the end of the day a Tory Chancellor, I know for a fact that they did not want to bring in as generous a furlough scheme as they did. It was Unite and the TUC and the various affiliate unions that were literally at the negotiating table that basically said to him, unless you want riots in the street, unless you want strikes during a pandemic, you must introduce a generous furlough scheme. It's nowhere near enough, but there's a reason that we have got an 80% scheme. I don't see that going beyond March. Like, I don't know if they're going to extend that. Obviously, we will still lobby for that. But that is the worst. That's the thing that I worry about most in the next 3 months for workers, is that they withdraw that furlough scheme, which is already not enough. Like, as you say, 80% of £6 an hour. Like, we represent people that are living on £4.70 an hour. Like, so if that gets removed, that's a huge safety net. And then there's still over 1 million people across the UK that haven't had a single payment of furlough since March because they fell through the gaps of that. So there's so much that could happen, and it could absolutely get worse.
It's the people that maybe we don't like. There was a guy that used to come in once a month, and he cleaned all the windows, and he was a window cleaner. That was his job. And I don't know. He just dropped in the shop. We paid him. We cleaned the windows. That was it. I don't know where he is, and I don't know how he makes his money. And I worry about people. I worry about people that they don't have anything on paper. That will maybe working cash in hand, benefits the employer because they don't have to pay. Yeah. And then issues like this come about, and it's just, all right, that's it. Beat it.
Yep.
And as you said, there are like migrant workers and people who maybe don't know what's going to happen with going back to Europe or whatever. They're going to be in a really worse situation because maybe the rights aren't there to even protect them. And as you said, the employers, like, they're not a priority for the Tory government, but the employers don't give a shit.
Totally. They've just been used as cannon fodder for... obviously there's been migrant workers in Britain for centuries, but you know, after say 2006, when there was an influx of Polish migration, they are still absolutely being used as like the lowest paid workers in hospitality. For example, like 80% of the workers, the housekeepers in hotels that we represent, are Polish, Romanian or Bulgarian. Like, they're all from a certain demographic. That isn't because it's certainly not because they're lazy or because they're not hard working. It's because they have been seen to be the cheapest form of labour, and like that, and they're invariably women as well. So you've got like young migrant women who are still getting paid less. Like, we represent workers who are getting £4 or £5 an hour. They're getting paid less than the minimum wage because that is better than not having a job, and that's the way they see it. And the employers take advantage of that.
There's a lot of, when you do work, if you think back to your first job and your first paycheck and you feel like you're a bit independent, if employers take that away for you, the consequence could be that somebody's stuck in maybe a abusive relationship, or they're living in sort of shit housing accommodation, and they just accept it because on their list of things, that's the priority. The priority is, I need to make it enough money.
It does cascade down, doesn't it? And at the moment, we're hearing a lot of people are just working every hour, every day just to get enough money, just to get by. Never mind people working to have either a social life or to do nice things, to go on holiday when we can never go back on holiday. These things are pipe dreams for a lot of people and have been before COVID. Every day, taking every shift that they can and bare minimum wage, constantly getting exploited, and then they go home and then the landlord's exploiting them. So there is massive issues, and if we don't speak to these people, I suppose we don't find them, and we can't find ways to try and sort of fix the situation.
Do you ever come across people that think they might be a bit too proud to ask for support or help? I mean, I just got something in my head. There was a guy that came into our shop in Govan. He wanted to sell his 2 iPhone 7s. And when he told the boy behind the counter why he was selling them, which was literally just to put money in his electricity meter, like he said to me, I just felt bad. I just told him to keep the phones. I just gave him money. And then I seen the same guy about a week later, and he came in and said, oh, thanks, blah, blah, blah. He wanted to get his back. I said, listen, it's fine. But I seen the look in his eyes, and he just felt like he didn't want to be in that situation. And he was trying his best. Maybe he was a young father. I don't know if I'd imagine maybe he lives in a house with kids, and maybe he's got a partner or whatever, but I don't know that. But he just didn't want to be in that situation, and he didn't want to ask for help. He would rather sell his phones, which for me is sadder because then maybe that's what his kids need for school or whatever. And it's just people are in such a bad situation. You see like the rise in food banks and stuff. Sometimes they celebrate the opening of a food bank.
So bad.
Tory councillors going in cutting ribbons and stuff, and you're like, is this what Britain's going to be like?
Yeah.
And this was before, like, even the pandemic sort of kicked off. This, like, it's been tough for years and been getting tougher. Yeah. And I worry, like, there's offices all around here, right? And I know that our footfall in our shops went down because the offices under there. That means they'll maybe working from home. But what I worry about is that these employers are going to think, all right, I don't need these offices anymore. And then you get people who relied on their jobs that aren't going to exist anymore, and that's going to ripple out, and you're going to find we're just creating a worse situation. Banks will be saying people, just work from home. It suits the banks because they need to pay a rent then. But it's not like they're going to pass that money on to their employees. They're not going to get wage rises or whatever from working from home. They're kind of doing them a favour. Right now it's for safety, but in future they may say, okay, just stay at home. It's
massively going to affect workers that are now forced to homework, and I think that's one of the things that people should definitely challenge. There's homework agreements on sort of the Workvoice Pay website and things like that, and there's definitely things that you can use to challenge it, but we are going to see that people forced to work from home, so they're going to have higher household bills as well. When people are asked to work from home, it should never be to the detriment of themselves. They should never be more out of pocket, but we know from experience that we are going to see that, and more working people than ever are using food banks. I volunteered over Christmas period for a local community interest, and we had so many messages from families saying, I've never had to ask for help, I'm so embarrassed, I've always worked, but because of the situation they've lost their jobs, and asking for help to provide Christmas food at Christmas or toys for their kids so their kids don't wake up going without, and it's so sad. And as you said, you can see these people are so proud, and it's horrible. But I think that there is a sense of community, which is good. So I do think that having a community, people in the community should help each other when they can. But I don't agree with this massive food bank thing with the government taking no responsibility now, and working class people are solely responsible for helping feed other working class people, because it's been basically a downward spiral since the past 3 basically since 2010 with the rise in food banks, and now people every day, every week rely on these food banks, so they can never get there. At the moment they're finding it impossible to get out of this sort of rut.
I mean, it's just on one side you've got the government that's making it very tough for people to they sort of just make them feel like they're divided, like we'll blame somebody or they're blaming, and then on the other side you guys are like pulling people together, try to remind people, oh listen, you can be, I know it's united, you're united, there's like, and I think more people need to realise that. remember Russell Brand years ago was talking about the connection people have, and they say like so many people go to a football game, and just because they support the same football team, they'll be chanting and they're desperate to want. Because if you put that energy into other things, you could achieve so much. If you imagine 50,000 people that are like, all right, we are demanding that there's more money for like, I don't know, single people or vulnerable people or migrants or whatever. I just came in my head there. Peaky Blinders, there's a lot of union stuff. He's a bit dodgy, that Tommy Shelby, but there's like people should be able to relate to that. You shouldn't just be like, oh, that was back then, because it's no Ricky Gervais. I put something up, a quote for him about what it was like for his mother, and saying that even when she came home from work, like her dad would come home, that would be his job finished, but his mum would come home, and then her job was still going on. So had to cook, clean, this, that, the next thing. He goes, these are the women that sort of built up the country and made sure everybody's fed and cleaned, not just for their own kids, but other kids. Now I think the way the world's gone is that we although social media is supposed to bring people together, it kind of doesn't, and people don't know who their neighbours are. They don't really recognise what's going on. And as Bryan said, like the mental health impact of the pandemic, and obviously I do a lot of filming in the boxing gyms. There's young kids that would be relying go to the clubs, and the coaches would keep an eye on them, sometimes be like a sort of social work, older brother, even a mother or father on the one, and coaches are saying to me, listen, I don't know where these kids are, I dropped them a message, but I don't know if there's stuff going on in the background, or they're out in the street, or if they're struggling, and I think that's what the Tories always try and do, is break people down, break them down so they can unite together to fight.
I think division, I mean, but even the media as well, sram down our throats every day, division, isn't it? Pitting everyone against each other, people on benefits, single parents, folk with disabilities, everyone basically.
The only thing, the whole idea with agency work and 0-hour contracts was so people maybe didn't feel like they had the same rights as everybody else that were working with, and they couldn't get together, and an employer could just get rid of people as they wanted.
I think I understand why people switch off when they hear politics, when they hear people talking about the Tories or Labour or whatever, right? But the Tories have always been ideologically opposed to working people coming together, because it's literally the antithesis of what they stand for. And the reason they're happy to open food banks is because, as Claire says, that is absolutely their ideology, which is that people should not rely on the state. They don't want an NHS, despite Boris banging on about 350 million quid for the NHS, or saying that he loves the NHS. They have systematically starved the NHS of funding. Labour did not do what they should have to support the NHS, and they helped things like PFI and helped to privatise it through the back door. But the Tories, and this is, you can look this up. There's private documents in 2010 that showed what the Tories actually wanted to do with the NHS, which was complete privatisation on a similar way to what they have in America, where everyone's got insurance, but that insurance is relying on your job, so that imagine, like, we're relying obviously on more jobs and income and everything else, but imagine you break your arm or something more serious, like you have a heart attack, and you literally have to sell your house to get cancer treatment. Like, that is exactly where the Tories want working people to be, in a totally, like Tony Benn talked about it, workers who can't go on strike are the best possible workers, because they're like, they've got a ball and chain to a mortgage, or they've got a ball and chain to like have to pay for healthcare. Like, that's an ideal situation for Tories, because they don't want working people to realise their collective clout, but also to fight back collectively. But just to give you one example of how I know that we are doing the right thing in the trade union movement, the Tories have just cut, I think it was only 4 or 5 million quid, but they've just cut Union Learning Fund. So it wasn't directly from the Tories. We've had it for 20 odd years, but we get government funding in order to educate workers, whether that be on the law, whether that be on, it's not just the rights at work. It's like, we teach workers sign language, we teach workers Polish, we teach workers like everything you can think of, and that was all done through their union. I can't remember the exact stats on it, but for every pound that was spent on the government, it was something like 5 or 6 quid was given back into the economy through us training these workers. They just cut that in the middle of a pandemic. Like 5 million quid to them is literally nothing. I mean, it's a tenth of what it would have cost to feed kids, and they didn't even want to do that. Do you know what I mean? But like, that gives you an example. They don't want unions to be teaching workers about their own rights. Like, that's the last thing they want. That's too radical for them. So they cut that. So there's now like hundreds of thousands of workers that did gain from getting effectively free education who are now not going to get that. And that's totally callous. That's got nothing to do with like money saving or whatever. Because as I said, they've given hundreds of millions over in like contracts that have been so screwed up with like vaccinations and stuff. So the way I look at it is we must be doing something right in trade unions because the Tories absolutely hate us. Like, do you know what I mean? Like they're doing everything they can to like undermine us. So we're not just a third party organisation. I'd say we've gotten better at representing workers because we're actually on the side of working people.
Is social media helping with that?
I think so.
Yep, we've had to change how we do things over the years as well, and then with COVID as well, it's changed massively how we would organise workers. But we have to use it to our benefit. It just opens up a different community online, and I suppose realising how many people we can reach that maybe previously we didn't even attempt to reach maybe the same. So it's difficult not speaking to people on the ground, like getting boots on the ground, speaking to people face to face in their workplaces, and that will be an issue going forward with more people than ever working from home. We'll just have to adapt and find other ways using social media, using Zoom to reach these people and find a way of bringing them together so they feel part of something, whether they're working from home or they're in the office or they're in a factory. That shouldn't really matter anymore. We've got the means now, and social media should help us, helps us include more people. See the amount of people that said that they could never make meetings or branch meetings, they could never go to any of their staff meetings because they'd maybe caring responsibilities and had to leave, or it was a time that didn't suit. Now people can obviously tune in remotely. So that's a positive. We have to take that from it, and that won't go away now. We'll always use these tools forevermore.
I've certainly found it easier because hospitality, as you know, is younger. They were already way more tech savvy than I was in terms of like using like they're on TikTok when I'm thinking like Twitter is brand new. Do you know what I mean? Like they're like on it.
Do you know how, just sort of interrupt you, that during the protests of the Indian farmers, all these aunties, like older women in the Indian community, were sharing videos on TikTok, and that's how they got the information. And I think sometimes these things happen by accident. During like the London riots, they had it was BBM, and the Black Period was never set up for working class young people to be sharing like broadcast messages and stuff. It was set up for businesses to communicate with their executive boards and staff or whatever. That's what even the way it looked like a wee keyboard. And by accident, and also the way it worked is that BBM signal they couldn't stop. They couldn't switch off. Whereas they could have switched off the 4G, 3G, 2G connections, but they couldn't have switched that off. And I think I remember when they were going after some of the people that were coordinating it, because the company was based in Canada, it was just a nightmare for them to. It was
sort it.
Yeah,
it was the same thing. The Egyptian Revolution was based on BBM and like early social media that couldn't be shut down by the government. Like that is one of the ways that they organised. But I don't want to be ageist here, but the vast majority of the workers I represent in hospitality are way more savvy than I am, so they're able to and we can substitute. There is no substitute for face to face, as Claire says, but we've got Zoom has been like amazing for seeing the white in people's eyes. I love nothing more than like facing off a employer. It's like because obviously there's people are still doing their jobs at the end of the day, but we are right up to director level. Do you know what I mean? We like face off people that are on £250,000 a year that are sacking hundreds and thousands of people, and it's beautiful to like face them off in Zoom. Do you know what I mean? Because you can say and do things that you might not be able to say if you were face to face with them, and it gives workers a bit of confidence as well, because there's an anxiety and stress about like physically facing off the employer. But there is nothing but like I'm obviously safely looking forward to like having a big meeting of workers. Like I miss doing that.
Yeah.
All right. I think that covers
Quite a
everything I
lot.
want to say. Yeah, how long has it been? I can't see that.
An hour?
screen. Yeah, it's seen the one just
An
on the
hour
right.
bang on.
Yeah, bang on an hour. Listen, thanks so much for coming in. As I said, I've known you in the past, and I've got a lot of respect for everything you do, even out with sort of trade union movement and stuff. And hopefully this discussions like this can continue, and we can maybe some of your colleagues I know we've been speaking to about coming on and speaking about different ways people can get together. But I think definitely the way forward is people need to realise that the only way we'll be able to be safe and succeed moving forward is by coming together. Not just through obviously workers' rights, but there's so much more we can do as a sort of unit. Listen, Bryan, Claire, thank you so much.
Can I do one last pitch for the website?
Go for it.
Because like
Oh,
we just keep saying
I've got the
Unite,
website. See if you look now, this will be.
you can see it at the same
there's
time.
there's the website. I'll go a bit slow.
So I'm not being offensive because both of us work for Unite, but the Unite Hospitality website's sexier. Like it's better looking.
If you're doing Unite, I would do
Can you
Unite
get access to it from here?
You should do. Aye.
When I do Unite,
Yeah. So work voice pay is great.
So the problem is I can't see the screen.
See, it's like the first dark blue one. So keep
That's
it
one.
aye.
Oh, there we go.
So work
I would
voice
do Unite
pay.
Hospitality though. I think
Aye.
I'd be more comfortable that way.
Like Unite, so if you're in the hospitality industry, and just to be clear, because some people don't know explicitly what that means, if you work in a bar, a restaurant, a cafe, or a hotel, or a casino, then check us out at Unite Hospitality, because we're the bespoke union for that sector. But if not, check out Unite and Work Voice Pay, which basically brings together. So Unite is 1.5 million members, and we represent every single area of the economy, from like bin workers to doctors. So like everyone that you can think of, unless they're in a specialist role. So if like you're a nurse or whatever, you will probably be able to join Unite. So that's.
I used to get excited, as I said, when my mum and brother, they both work for the NHS. I used to get excited when there was like ballots and stuff come through. I was like, oh, he's got that. Because it is important. Like, I mean, my dad, he worked in the Yaras shipbuilding like years ago, so it's like, for a young age, knowing what like say a shop steward was always like just a word that I just knew. I remember even there was a school teacher in Drumchapel High, and I knew that he was a shop steward, and he used to speak to me about like, because I was in the youth parliament and stuff. He was like, "Oh, you should try and say this," because when Glasgow City Council started reshaping like, the school hours and stuff, it was to save something like 26 teaching staff. So rather than we went to school like
he was lobbying you on behalf
Aye,
of the
really?
Tracy.
And it's obviously like I still speak to a lot of the teachers for school, and they've always been part of our union and emphasised the importance of it. And I suppose teaching staff and shipbuilders and NHS workers are one thing, but there's a lot of other people that can benefit for a union. And there is if people can't even afford, if there's people that are like say from like a refugee background and stuff, that there's ways they can join a union even if they struggle to pay. Is that right?
Yeah, there's reduced rates as well, and there's also other groups that you can contact if, as Bryan said, if you're not a member of a trade union and you've got an open sort of case. Quite a lot of trade unions don't take that on, except for you, Bryan. But that's when you can contact places like Better Than Zero. So they campaign, they'll also signpost you to the union of your sector for the future, but they'll offer good support and advice if needed. So there's lots of ways you can do it. TUC website's great. You can go and check what union you should be in for your sector if you're looking to do that.
There's always good people. You never meet somebody in a union that's that. I suppose you probably know them. I don't. There's people that come to the shop, and if they've got a Unite sort of lanyard, ask, "Oh, do you know Bryan? Do you know Claire? Do you know Suki? Do you know this?" And then they get a discount out of it, and it sort of feels like,
They're
oh,
like,
you can.
I
They're
don't
all
know
like
why.
happy family.
People but they're always nice. There's always people that, as you said, the actual care. You feel good when you've done something for somebody. You've changed somebody's life for maybe bad to good, and gave them that independence and that confidence to sort of that ripples out across their life.
It's not a job, is it? It's your life. Like, this is what you do, and you do it in your spare time as well.
We do bloody 14-hour days, but I still think we've got the best job in the world, because as Claire says, it's like I have no, like, it's the best feeling in the world to give confidence to workers. Like, it's an amazing feeling to see people, as you say, in their third job after beating an employer who was intransigent for years, they finally won, and they've passed that on to like dozens and dozens of people.
Yep.
But we've got a membership rate that's 50 pence a week. So like that's the cheapest rate. That's if you're low paid or you're not in employment, like that is what you're looking at to get support. But as Claire says, like Better Than Zero will advise and support and signpost you to like the right people. But just sorry on the bit about like working class solidarity, like the concept of solidarity is like thrown about a lot. Sturgeon talks about it when she talks about like us having solidarity with like others during this crisis. But like that for me is the fundamental skill set of working people. Like every working class person has the capacity, even if they don't show it, they've got empathy for everyone in their community. A lot of people have been ground down to a point in which they do blame migrant workers, or they do blame refugees, or they blame their neighbour, or they blame whatever, when actually invariably it's their boss or the government. Like it's about the key thing that unions try and get across, apart from the advice and support and collective solidarity, is like empathy for your fellow worker, because that's the only way that we're actually going to like build a better society.